Robbie Martin has been wanting to do a live stream with me on a variety of issues, Tulsi and other stuff. And so we finally got around to it. As you can see, he is being represented by a giant screen of black, which kind of adds to his mystique, I would say.
Thanks for having me on, Michael.
Yeah, no problem. So hopefully you're going to have to content yourself with looking at my beautiful face, because that's the only one available to you throughout the stream. Okay, so do you want to continue on the stream of thought that we had going before I pressed live, or should we start from the beginning, or how do you want to do it?
Maybe that discussion will be left best for off air for the time being. But
okay, we'll leave people in suspense then.
Yeah, Russiagate related,
right.
But we should talk. I think it would be fun to talk about that maybe after talking about Tulsi, if we have time. I don't know how much time you have. I got about an hour.
I got as much time as you need. I'm
okay.
Good.
Cool. So take it away. Yeah.
I feel like you had a sort of a proposition, or you had sort of a introductory premise.
Yes.
So why don't you just lay that out?
Sure. Well, I guess maybe the best place to start is in a place where we might agree on some of the, critiques I've been leveling at Tulsi. So I found a tweet of yours from an old, I think it was like maybe 2018, when we were going back and forth, and you said, I think you were tweeting about how she's getting attacked for being an Assadist, which is a ridiculous smear. And you said that you wanted to focus on the Assadist attacks, but you said you're right that there are other aspects of her political sensibility that warrant legitimate scrutiny. So I guess I wanted to start maybe just by asking you, what, if any, things about her policies or her rhetoric that you think, or even her sensibility, that warrant legitimate scrutiny?
Okay. I think that tweet, if I'm remembering correctly, was shortly after she announced her campaign in January of this year. And the initial onslaught of attack virtually all had to do with Assad, and also they threw in the fact that she made some anti-gay comments when she was a teenager. So that's basically how she was introduced to the wider public, and which gives you a sense of why her negatives actually had been somewhat anomalously high for a while, even though she wasn't well known really. But at least among Democratic primary voters, her negatives were like a smidge. Her negative ratings were sort of like a smidge higher than you'd expect for somebody who's just only becoming someone who the public is only really becoming acquainted with now. So that was my instinct then. If a candidate or a political figure is being introduced to the public in a way that seems incredibly warped, and diminishes not just her, but some broader principles at stake, I felt it was perfectly warranted to to focus in on the illegitimacy of those attacks for the time being. But in terms of other aspects of her persona that merit scrutiny, well, just like any other figure, I think anything merits scrutiny. If you're asking me for certain specifics, I think one thing that I know that you've talked about, and which I also noted at the time in like another tweet from around that month or two time frame, was that to the extent that she's anti-war, she frames it more or less as being anti-regime change war. And obviously the U.S. is involved in all kinds of war-making endeavors that don't necessarily entail regime change. So that was basically the very first question I asked her when I had my 90-minute interview with her a couple months ago. What about those war-making endeavors that aren't necessarily tailored toward toppling a particular regime? And I thought she had a decent answer to it. I don't think she's not a pacifist, obviously, on all issues. And her her having been in the military kind of instills her with a belief that military power is not inherently bad. But at the same time, she was in New Hampshire in July, and around the 4th of July, marching in parades and stuff. And an NPR reporter trailed her and did an interview with her. And basically, the question that was posed to Tulsi was, do you think that any U.S. military intervention has been legitimate in modern American history? And she said that there are none that she would endorse since World War II. So I think that's a pretty stinging critique of U.S. policy writ large, whether regime change or not. And if you look at the interview that she did with Glenn Greenwald in May, she said that the war on terror has achieved like the opposite of its stated intention. So I think, to the extent that I have a reservation with her rhetoric, it's that I think she is a little too instinctually inclined toward adopting a terroristic paradigm, or she views issues through the prism of terrorism, which I think can be distorting. But if then you look at what her broader policy instincts are, I think more often than not, they override whatever bellicosity you might associate with widespread use of the word terrorist. For example, one of her signature issues, which led her to having the Assad meeting in the first place, which she went, which was in January of 2017, and Dennis Kucinich accompanied her. And Dennis Kucinich and I actually did a podcast around 2 weeks ago now, and he reminded me and the audience that the point of that trip was a fact-finding mission, because she was saying that the orientation of U.S. policy in Syria was to arm radicals / terrorists. So she's almost kind of like and that's not, that viewpoint doesn't really further the traditional war on terror paradigm. Otherwise, I don't think Dennis Kucinich would ever have associated with it, right? So she's, in a way, I kind of almost get the sense that she appropriates the nomenclature of terrorism to further anti-war ends, if that makes sense. And I understand why people might have apprehension about the overuse of that term. I do as well, especially in relation to how certain politicians and journalists have reacted to the El Paso shooting, where they're saying we have to kind of import a war on terror paradigm domestically and pass new domestic terrorism statutes, which inevitably, obviously, are going to increase the surveillance and prosecutorial powers of the federal government. So I think it's legitimate to have wariness about the overuse of that term. But I think for the most part, if you actually look at what she's advocating, it's sort of a synthesis it's sort of an unusual synthesis, which people have a hard time wrapping their minds around, which is that she has sort of a conservative temperament in a way, which I think derives from her military service, which is ongoing. I mean, she's, as you know, right now engaged in a National Guard training mission. But she couples that with, I think, a fairly penetrating analysis of U.S. foreign policy overall, stretching back decades. And if you look at who some of her influences are, tell me if I'm going on too long, but she, Stephen Kinzer, I know, is a big influence on her, and she cites one of his books, Overthrow, as central to her worldview. And if you read that book, it's a unsparing and brutal assessment of virtually every U.S. intervention since the 1800s that entailed the overthrow of a regime. And I think it's legitimate to think of contemporary U.S. policy through the regime change paradigm, because we've had like 5 of them in the past 15 years. So, I mean, that seems to be among enough of a predominant emphasis policy-wise that I can see why she believes framing her critique through that lens is warranted. So I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wanted to respond to a few things you said. So the World War II comment you made is interesting. I'd like to circle back to that in a second, but just on the last thing you said, so this is something I think we probably strongly disagree on. The idea of framing things now around regime change wars. Now, while you're definitely right, the last 15, 17 years has been largely defined by, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya,
Syria.
from an actual White House report released in 2018. This is a quote from defense1.com. It's like a military news website. This is from the official White House report. It says groups the U.S. military is currently fighting. This is actively bombing 7 countries, right? Since 2018. I don't know what's changed since then, but the groups the U.S. military is fighting: Al Qaeda, ISIS, the Houthis in Yemen, the Taliban, which people can argue if that's, a lot of people like to label Taliban as a terrorist group. I don't personally classify it that. The Haqqani network, the Assad regime, which is potentially one regime change plan that's actively happening, and then Al-Shabaab and elements in Niger assessed to be part of ISIS. So in total, this is what our active munitions, our drone strikes, probably most of our bombing campaigns are. I don't know that exactly, are actively engaged in fighting these alleged terrorist groups.
Can I just interject really quickly, because I think you should probably, just for posterity, throw in Venezuela, as another regime change example that's incredibly current.
Yes,
and she was the first Democratic candidate to explicitly condemn that, in straightforward terms, where even Bernie equivocated. And I'm not, just to be clear, I haven't endorsed Tulsi. I'm not speaking as some kind of campaign surrogate or anything like that. Obviously, I've expressed affinity with her in different respects. So it doesn't preclude criticism. So I don't want anybody to think that necessarily I'm speaking as if I'm a cable news pundit who hasn't is endorsed and I'm on Team Tulsi or anything. So just so that's clear.
Yeah, I mean, so the Venezuela, yeah. So I would describe those more as, see, that's the interesting thing. So this idea of overtly invading another country, occupying it, like in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, I think it could be argued that the current way administrations, or maybe even the Bush administration did this a little bit, but Obama and Trump, it seems that the new paradigm for regime change is almost like a mission creep that sort of creeps, where it's not just like a sledgehammer of, we're sending troops. I mean, although it could be at any time, it could get to that level. It appears, with the Venezuela situation, I don't know if I would classify that yet as a regime change war, even though I do believe sanctions are war. You could.
Well, it was a regime change operation. It wasn't done through a direct invasion, but
yes.
Even if you look at when there was that aid convoy, quote unquote, sent in February, that was facilitated using military personnel. So I mean, there's a way in which you could almost characterize that as a military directed regime change operation, even if it wasn't an explicit invasion, which I don't think anybody has really claimed, but it still fits into the regime change paradigm. As did like the near war that we almost had with Iran, in June. So I mean, you have like a lot of pretty pressing and examples of regime change operations, whether explicitly war or not, that I think again bolster the case for framing current policy, at least through that paradigm, while also granting that there's a wide variety of endeavors that the U.S. is engaged with all over the world that aren't explicitly tailored around regime change per se.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with that. I think my problem lies with the idea that most of the people we're killing right now, whether they're these alleged terrorist targets or civilians, are in the name of all these other groups I just listed that we are actively fighting against. So I feel that she is, and I don't know if this is intentional or what her reasons are for doing this, but I feel she is largely ignoring what I see as the most active way currently that our military is being used. If you separate the idea of just like troops being deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq, I'm talking about the bombings, the drone strikes, the extrajudicial killings. That appears to be more, just in terms of violence, in terms of our, weaponry and things like that. And I guess I find that very troubling. Like, even if we, like, let's put aside her whole "I'm a dove on regime change, but a hawk on terror," just all, apart from that quote completely, it seems that she doesn't really address, this basically this endless campaign to attack these kinds of terrorist networks. And I mean, I see that as highly problematic for someone sort of representing themselves as an anti-war candidate, even though I know she doesn't say I am anti-war. She says I'm anti-regime change wars. So I'm just wondering, what is the point really in making that distinction? I mean, is she, but I also think it is an interesting thing to explore, is what does she mean by being a hawk on the war on terror? And I don't know if you actually asked her that in your interview, but Greenwald did at the very end of his interview, and it kind of just inexplicably ends. Like, when she's it doesn't really get explained. And I feel like
that interview, by the way, the interview with Greenwald that she did was supposed to be longer, but they had like some, they had a logistical issue. But it was supposed to go on for another like 30 or 40 minutes. Okay. And that was, she would have, I think, elaborated on that. But you say that when you say that she's ignoring these issues, I almost think you have to fault the media for the fact that these issues are ignored across the board. So it shouldn't just be me and Greenwald who even bring up this issue. Maybe if I didn't do it quite as directly as he did, I thought I brought up an aspect of it. But if we had a more curious media, which was more acquainted with how U.S. foreign policy actually works, then maybe you would hear her address this more explicitly on more regular occasions. But that's not how the media operates. So, I mean, do you hear any candidate really address it? I almost think that you can't blame her for the fact that the media climate overall just is not conducive to an exploration of these issues. She's, to the extent that she has a specific message, it's obviously around regime change, which again I think is legitimate. That doesn't mean it precludes also weighing in on other aspects of U.S. foreign policy. But I don't know that it's fair to say that she's necessarily ignoring it. It's just that it's ignored across the board, so it's almost like a more systemic problem than something that's specific to her in terms of not getting enough exposure. Like, does Bernie talk about it? I know you're not like a Bernie promoter or anything, but like, does anybody really talk about it?
No, I mean, I agree with the part of your premise that that the media is largely ignoring what I just talked about, which is I would argue the most active way our actual military is engaged right now in terms of committing violence, murdering people in foreign countries. So you're absolutely right about that. I just think, as someone sort of running with the anti-war mantle, I feel, I mean, and maybe this is almost kind of egoist to say, I feel it's almost like her duty in a way to express some of these things that the media is ignoring, because people, and I know Kucinich has pretty soft on her right now, but I feel that Kucinich and Paul, they did raise these issues even when they were sort of passé. They weren't really in the debate anymore. So I feel like, in terms of comparing her to previous sort of iterations of what an anti-war Democrat on a Republican or Democrat side would look like, she is not trying to inform the American public on what you correctly described as a complete, basically ignoring what is actively happening in the war on terror right now.
I mean,
I find that troubling personally.
I think I think you're right in a way, but I think part of that has to do with the time in which Kucinich and Paul ran. So Kucinich ran in 2004 and 2008, and Paul ran in 2008 and 2012, right? So in 04 and 08 was while George W. Bush was president, and the war on terror was still something that people spoke about in those terms. I mean, you don't really hear the phraseology of the war on terror uttered in the media or the political discourse writ large that much anymore. So it just
the name of it. Yeah.
Say that again.
I said even Obama, when he got in office, he tried to change it to GWAT or whatever, the globe, some weird acronym. They were trying to rebrand it ever since 2008.
And even if you look at like the official national defense strategy that the Pentagon puts out, they've made a whole stink about how now they're transitioning away from a war on terror framework into a power struggle framework. So the national security of the United States is now supposed to be oriented around counteracting the influence of China and Russia, which is also something that Tulsi talks about. And by the way, she's the only candidate who even remotely has criticized the Trump-Russia narrative and the dangers that poses geopolitically, which I think is also a huge point in her favor in terms of, I mean, honestly, bravery, because to do that in the context of a Democratic primary is almost like political suicide. And she's not only doing it, but she's actually gained something of a following around that issue in particular, whereas Bernie's totally avoided it, or at worst, actually validated some of the fallacious premises of the Trump-Russia narrative. So I almost think that her emphases now are like a product of the times, just as Paul's and Kucinich's were. And I think it does say something that both Paul and Kucinich are very praiseworthy of Tulsi to the point of almost endorsing her. I mean, Ron Paul kind of semi-endorsed her within the context of a Democratic primary. Kucinich, sure, couldn't, say enough nice things about her in my interview and elsewhere. And Mike Gravel, who is, if you want to talk about it, somebody who was ostracized for his anti-war views, I mean, he's endorsed Tulsi. So, I mean, those three guys aren't perfect, obviously, but I think it does say something that they endorse to an extent the way in which she is framing her foreign policy critique in 2019 compared to how you might have framed it in 2007. I just think there are different issues that are foremost in the public mind now, and she's sort of reacting to that.
I mean, that could possibly be the case. I would actually like to. It would be really interesting to actually get Kucinich to speak on this issue we're talking about now, whether he thinks it's problematic to ignore, like you said, the mainstream media is ignoring what is happening in the war on terror right now. It'd be really interesting to get his opinion on that, because I know I've seen him. He's very much his praise is almost effusive. Ron Paul's has been a little more lukewarm. Obviously, he's paleo conservative. But that is a very interesting thing that I would like to hear from them. There are some other, and this is maybe I'm jumping a little too far here, but someone who sort of someone that I respected from the anti-war movement for a long time.
Can I just, before I forget, can I just address one thing you said?
Yeah.
So there's this quote that people love to, to rail about, where she says, "I'm a dove on regime change war, but a hawk on the war on terror." This kind of gets to why I've kind of thought about her using the war on terror phraseology or the nomenclature and appropriating it so that she's kind of flipping the meaning, in the sense that she was talking about that in the context of Syria. So she's saying that the outcome or the end result of U.S. policy in Syria in particular has been to embolden people that you might describe as terrorists, such as ISIS. I mean, I don't think that's too much of a stretch, even though I don't particularly like that word, and I generally shun its use because I think it just makes people, give up their critical faculties and exalt like terrorist violence into a whole different realm of violence as it's somehow like more metaphysically significant. So I that's not my approach, but I think her approach is like in the context of that quote, she wasn't saying that, therefore I want to like supercharge the George W. Bush approach to counteracting terrorism. She's saying I want to rein back the ways in which U.S. foreign policy, although it claims to be claims to have the intention of stamping out terrorists, has actually created a fertile breeding ground for more terrorists to the point where now Al Qaeda is stronger than it was at now than it was in 2001, et cetera, et cetera. So I think people kind of misconstrue that quote. Although it's not. I don't think it was the greatest phrasing on her part, but I think if you just look at that quote in a vacuum, then I think it's open to misinterpretation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that. I didn't. For me, I mean, the context seemed like it was in a broader sense. When I read the piece it was quoted in, it didn't seem like she was talking specifically about Syria. And I feel like if she was, she would have said that to Greenwald and that interchange when he directly asked her about that. I mean, she literally like just goes into sort of a rant about how Al Qaeda attacked us on 9/11, and she doesn't. And the key part of the question, how is she going to be a hawk on terror? It just wasn't really addressed. And
yeah, I mean, again, I wish Greenwald had 3 hours with her, right? But it was kind of that interview was truncated, and so even if you ask Greenwald, he'll say that he would have liked to have her expand on that a little more, but he wanted to fit in a whole bunch of stuff, and so they kind of had to move on pretty quickly. But I think if you take the totality of her statements and her policy positions, I think what I just laid out in terms of the way to interpret her statement there, I think it's clear to me anyway. I mean, and I've spent a lot of time, talking to her, talking to people, around her, looking at her various statements and interviews and votes and everything. So, I mean, that's kind of my interpretation.
Well, I definitely don't share the interpretation, but I would like to. I mean, I guess.
But okay, but you don't share the interpretation. But the time period in which she gave that interview, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the original interview was around this time where she was promoting what was then her signature piece of legislation, which was the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. It had to do with Syria.
Yes.
So, and she was saying that, hey, we claim that we're hawks on terrorism, but the functional outcome of our policy is actually emboldening and sending arms to these quote unquote terrorists in Syria. So even if she didn't specifically refer to Syria there, that was kind of the thrust of what she was engaged in at the time. So that's why my impression was that it kind of related to her legislative endeavor at that point, and also it goes back to why she talks about the Saudis exporting Salafi Islam all over the world. I think that also factors into why she talks about these things in terms of terrorism. And I think there is something to that. I studied. It's funny. Like in college, I spent like an entire half of one of my of a year studying the exportation of extreme Wahhabi Islam from Saudi Arabia, through a network of nonprofits and mosque networks and ostensibly humanitarian groups all over the world, and it was never really discussed out in the open. Today, I think more people are aware of it, and she's kind of made that also a central issue, which I also think is legitimate. Look, you can't, if you're a message candidate where you're running on a specific set of premises, I don't know that it's reasonable to expect that you're going to incorporate every single, like Ron Paul, I think, if he had a signature issue with respect to foreign policy, it was blowback, right? Because he had the infamous exchange, or the famous exchange, with Rudy Giuliani in 2007 at the South Carolina Republican debate, where Ron Paul posited that in order to understand why 9/11 occurred, you have to look at what the people who carried out 9/11 said their motivation was. And part of their motivation was that the U.S. had, bases in Saudi Arabia and that kind of thing. And all throughout the campaign, Ron Paul was asked to justify that claim over and over again, and the nature of blowback, et cetera. And did Ron Paul have a more expand on other aspects of foreign policy? Sure, but he had he had sort of like a thrust of his message, and so I think all of them, all these guys, Gravel, Paul, Kucinich, seem to recognize that the thrust of Tulsi's message is, as of today, something that's very much needed in American political discourse, and is, caused a lot of people to think about foreign policy in a different light, especially because she's sort of a unique messenger, someone who, it's not like doesn't come across like a left-wing ideologue. She has sort of an affect that, again, derives, I think, from her military background of being reserved and also committed to national honor as she sees it. And so she can be sort of an effective messenger for that kind of critique in a way that others, who are, more kind of like traditional left-wing activists might not be able to do, and might not reach the same kind of audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what's happening here, is what I would describe as some of the vagueness of her rhetoric. I think on some level you are interpreting tea leaves in a positive way, and I'm sort of doing the opposite. I'm trying to put some of these pieces together and look at her whole total rhetoric, and I'm coming to the conclusion where it's negative. So, like, in terms of the quote, like, you're sort of placing this in the context of she's talking about Syria, and specifically, around the timing of her Stop Arming Terrorists Act. I simply don't know if that's the case, and I would like her, and I think it's really important, especially to get more anti-imperialist left type people on board with her, to explain in detail how she means being a hawk, because that's saying you're going to be a hawk on anything foreign policy, that understandably scares certain people away, including myself. So I think it's really, really important, and even maybe vital, not maybe not for this campaign, obviously, because she's polling so low already, but for her future political career, to specify some of these things and exactly how she would be a hawk, because these are,
no, I think that's legitimate, and it's important to remember she's been on the national political scene for about 2 minutes. I mean, she's 38 years old. I think she had an experience in 2016 that sort of changed her trajectory in politics. And I think she's still in the process of sort of accumulating a wider breadth of knowledge that will inform a more fulsome critique, at a certain point. Now, maybe if she's a presidential candidate, should that critique be fully formed? Maybe you could make that argument. But my impression of her is that, she's sort of developing what you're saying she ought to develop. And I almost think if we had a healthier media environment, where these issues were brought up regularly, then then there would be a more of a let me restate. If more of the media was informed by the analysis that you are putting forward, which I think is warranted, then we'd have a climate where everybody, not just her, were challenged to formulate an agenda that is responsive to these concerns around what does it mean to be a hawk, et cetera. But again, I think because people just kind of pick up these little bits and pieces and interpret them in the least charitable possible way. I don't know. That's the greatest way of doing it. Again, I think she says she's a hawk on terrorism, but I really do think that she was referring specifically to reining in the ways in which U.S. foreign policy has contributed to the creation of terrorism. So again, she was almost like appropriating that logic and flipping it on its head and kind of using it to further a policy goal that has nothing to do with what people ordinarily associate with hawkishness.
Yeah, I would like to. You articulated what you believe is her position very well. I would like to hear her articulate that, and I just simply haven't.
So in what venue do you think that would happen?
I think the chance was sort of already there. She did sort of a little I guess you could call it a little indie media tour. Going across various YouTube channels, Nico House, Glenn's, on The Intercept, Jordan Cheriton, and I just feel like these things should have been addressed in those interviews, and I just feel that they simply were not addressed seriously enough, or in some instances, I even believe she sort of even wiggled out a little bit and sort of moved on, call it a dodge of some of the questions that were asked in this regard to her. So I feel like that sort of was the chance in this election cycle. And I think, if she continues to sort of maintain this relationship with indie journalists, I'm hoping that some of these points I'm raising will be, more seriously considered and raised, and really make her explain herself.
Yeah. And by the way, I do think it's important that she did sort of cultivate a network of independent journalists who gave her a platform and gave her, positive feedback in a way, but also, not obviously totally, without strings, but, reinforce some of the more positive aspects of her message, where the point is, like, she's reliant on alternate media for validation more so than pretty much any other candidate, aside from, I guess, arguably Bernie. But so I think that actually is significant going forward, because they, in a sense, form her base. I'm oversimplifying, but I think
it's kind of a Ron Paul strategy in a way.
Yeah, it was kind of, it's a Ron Paul strategy in a way, and I think it's actually it was smart, because it ended up where she now has a significant support on the internet. I mean, I've noticed for actually a long time, even before, well before anybody really thought she was going to run, going back to 2017, that for whatever reason she strikes a chord online and generates a lot of attention and engagement. And I remember that just when I was kind of covering her initial trip to Syria, that it just seems to really get to something that's sort of internet based in terms of why what generates support or even consternation. She's somehow has a natural position in the internet bloodstream, which, for reasons that I don't know how to quite articulate. But I, in terms of like having that as her network, I think is really interesting, and should make you optimistic that these concerns could conceivably be addressed. I mean, and they could have, if people were had more tailored their questions to what you specifically had wanted her to respond to. It's just that I guess they just didn't happen to. I mean, I tried to some extent, but I wanted to cover a lot of different issues, not just foreign policy, et cetera. So and I've interviewed her subsequently, and I could even do it again, frankly, under certain circumstances. But yeah. Anyway, it's just I think it's worth just stepping back and recognizing that she is very anomalous in having a much different, in existing in a much different media ecosystem than almost anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that she definitely has a very unique place in this election. I've seen the the virility. Is that the right word to say? The viral nature of her.
Yeah.
For campaign success. I mean, I've watched it, from the very beginning.
Virality. I think virility is like if you have testosterone.
Yeah. Okay. Definitely wrong word. But so I guess let's just go back to the war on terror paradigm for a second, because, and these are things obviously Bernie hasn't even really delved into very much either. So in terms of, who's talking about these things, pretty much no one is. But I still think that, 18 years, 17 years after 9/11, these things need to be seriously addressed, such as the legal ramifications, this sort of legal gray area of being able to extrajudicially assassinate people in foreign countries, sort of the disposition matrix from the Obama era. I haven't heard her speak about really anything having to do with that. Like, and maybe she has, and perhaps you can cite an example, like in terms of, when these famous drone strikes have happened, like with Anwar al-Awlaki, or his niece that happened when Trump first got into office. I don't remember her speaking about that. It even appears in some instances she actually veers a little more to the right than even traditional Democrats on things like using the legal system to prosecute terrorists. So there was a couple examples of that when Bowie Bergdahl was done, the prisoner swap. She was very upset about that. She talked about that a few times and how she thought it was dangerous. But more recently, the John Walker Lind release from prison, I think he was released like 2 or 3 years earlier than his sentence on good behavior. She kind of tweeted, and she was making a comparison to Assange, but she was kind of tweeting that he should still be in jail, even though the justice system in the United States, deemed him that he was fit to be released from prison. So
remind me what the comparison to Assange she made was?
I think it was something, I don't have a quote in front of me. It was something like, why is Assange being detained while John Walker Lind is allowed to sort of be a free man? And there was something else I don't remember exactly.
Okay. I don't remember the exact quote either, but I mean, wouldn't that just be, again, maybe I shouldn't address it without remembering the exact quote, but the way that you lay it out there, it seems almost like she's pointing out a discrepancy or an absurdity in the justice system, more so than calling for more punitive punishment of John Walker Lind. But maybe she did. I don't quite remember.
I mean, I think it was a little bit of both in there. I mean, these things to me illustrate that she does, we've sort of gone back and forth about this on Twitter. Does she reinforce or subscribe or promote this sort of war on terror paradigm? And I think in certain instances she does. And those are just a couple instances. I mean, but in terms of does she actually believe in extrajudicial killing? Does she believe that we should be actively engaged in these 7 or 8 countries fighting these groups? I still feel like there's a void there where she hasn't really explained how she feels about that. And again, it's easy for her to not explain it because, like you said earlier, the media is simply ignoring it. So, but I still feel, I mean, and as an anti-imperialist, that it would definitely scare me less if she articulated, broken down some of these things that define the war on terror. And I'm not even talking about, and I do also have problems with her, sort of going after the Obama administration and later, I think 2017, for not using the phrase radical Islamic terrorism. She's sort of shifted now to saying Wahhabism, Salafism is what she believes is the primary cause of this Islamic radical terror that she calls it. But initially she didn't use that language. She just would say radical Islamic terrorism. And, to me that is, I mean, maybe this was before her turnaround that you're talking about, but those things to me do sort of reinforce the paradigm of what we understand as the war on terror. And I also find that, really problematic. So it's not just that she's ignoring these certain key things that define the war on terror. She has actually, I believe, reinforced them in these specific areas.
I remember that quote of hers was from, I believe, 2015. So it was while the Obama administration was still in power, and it was an interview on Fox News. And I can remember actually having a similar reaction to her in this sense at the time in terms of Obama's rhetoric, where Obama would say, ISIS is, it's not true Islam that they're espousing. And therefore it's wrong to ascribe any kind of theological motivation to what these malicious terrorists are doing in Iraq and Syria. And I remember sort of being flummoxed by that at the time. This is sort of like the peak of ISIS in 2014, 2015, when you could go and read Abu Akbar al-Baghdadi, laying out all these elaborate theological justifications for the subjugation of the Yazidis, where they weren't people of the book and therefore they had to be exterminated, whereas Jews and Christians could pay a fine and still theoretically, remain alive under ISIS rule, that kind of thing. And, that version of extreme, whatever you want to call it, radical Islam that was the operating principle of ISIS, I almost thought got elided by Obama in a way that wasn't really useful. I mean, if anything, so therefore I think Tulsi is saying, hey, call this the ideology that it actually is, and then you can get to the root causes of what is generating the ideology, such as the exportation of Wahhabism by Saudi Arabia, which the U.S. directly and indirectly supports and funds.
She didn't start mentioning that specifically until, I believe, the Trump administration. The Neil Cavuto interview you're talking about, she doesn't mention the exporting of Wahhabism from Saudi Arabia. She's just going after the Obama administration for not using the phrase radical Islamic terror.
Yeah, I mean, I think she was responding to a question put to her that was in a right-wing talking point framing, and she kind of just went with that framing, which obviously leaves out a lot of the nuance that would be necessary. But that's sort of almost the cost of talking on cable news at times. I think there are, again, that's another example of people over-interpreting one little quote that, if you put it in totality with everything else that she's advocating, seems to me to make perfect sense and doesn't actually reinforce the war on terror paradigm, because central to the war on terror paradigm, or at least I thought from the outset, was that Saudi Arabia was a key player in facilitating the war on terror, where they had U.S. troops stationed in Saudi Arabia to help wage the war in Iraq, and they were going to engage in all this kind of counterintelligence sharing and that kind of thing. And now we're even at a point today where the U.S. is directly aiding and abetting Saudi's continual bombardment of Yemen. So if you only had that quote, right, on Neil Cavuto in 2015, whenever that was, then sure, you might really have some misgivings about what she's talking about. But I think when you kind of incorporate it into her overall critique, it seems to make sense. So that's why I think it's almost a little futile to monomaniacally hone in on that one individual quote when you have a breadth of evidence and data that telling you that it was part of a more holistic critique that she was making that had Syria at its focal point, but that was just sort of the messaging that she used to advance a policy proposal that really was almost the antithesis of what the war on terror had been up until that point.
Well, I just wanted to, I misspoke earlier if I said that was the only quote. She did use the same phraseology perhaps two more times at least that I know of. Once was in her Christians United for Israel speech in 2015, and another time she did appear on Wolf Blitzer's program on CNN and also made the same argument. So if you rewatch that Neil Cavuto clip, I think you're characterizing it a little bit incorrectly. It wasn't that Neil Cavuto was posing the question to her, it was that Tulsi Gabbard was appearing on Neil Cavuto's program because she had already brought this up as an issue that was important to her. And it was sort of framed around the fact that she was already speaking about this. So it wasn't like Fox News asked, try to get her to espouse a right-wing talking point. It was something that she kind of brought onto the program on her own. So I mean, I could even send you the links to these additional clips if you'd like. I mean, but I think we probably just fundamentally disagree on not only the usefulness of bringing that kind of phrase into the mix, but also that I do believe, especially the neoconservatives early on after 9/11, very much wanted people in the American public to believe that, these people were basically, they were so religious that they didn't care if they, blew up their own children as suicide bombers. It was almost like, the most dehumanizing rhetoric.
Sure. But in the context of ISIS, right? Do you think that there was anything obfuscatory or about Obama and other political figures saying at the time that ISIS has nothing whatsoever to do with Islam, when you could look at the actual words and theological justifications of the leaders of ISIS and find that it actually was grounded in a pretty comprehensive understanding of their own, warped interpretation of, basically Salafi Islam? I mean, and if you ignore that, aren't you almost by extension ignoring the role that Saudi played in fertilizing that kind of extremism?
Yeah, I mean, I could understand that argument. I mean, I would say in response to that I don't think Obama and his administration put out very useful messaging in that regard. I understood their intentions. Like, I respect the intentions of trying to essentially downplay what I believe the Obama administration was doing, was trying to downplay the sort of terrorist specter that ISIS was trying to hold over, Americans or the West with all these snuff videos and things like that they're putting out. I think it was a really stumbling message that the Obama administration and even John Kerry would put out. So I in terms of his actual wording, I don't think it was delivered very well. But I do think that there's a sort of a more nuanced way to look at it here. And I'd like to go to a recent Scott Horton article. We actually wrote a pretty good piece, having similar issues that I do with Tulsi Gabbard, but he goes really deep into sort of, just the active sort of engagements we have right now with the war on terror. This article came out in July 30th of this year. And in it, Scott Horton says, plenty of Salafi and Wahhabi Muslims are perfectly peaceful. If anything, their quietest mandate to obey civil authority in all cases seems to lead to submission in the face of American-backed royal dictatorships rather than violent revolution against them. Of course, Al-Qaeda and ISIS's leadership share many of their fundamentalist views, but then again, many of their fighters and followers don't know much about the Quran at all. They fight in solidarity with others they see as having a shared identity. And I know that's not a very popular, type of way to insert nuance in the discussion about ISIS, but I think Scott is completely on target there. I mean, what do you think about?
I mean, I think that there's probably truth to that in terms of ordinary lay people who don't have much political power or, religious authority. But I think in terms of the key figures who promulgate Salafi Islam, those are the ones where I think the Tulsi critique holds. I mean, look at what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has said. I mean, how could you look at his own words and conclude anything other than it is a violent and sort of almost quasi-imperialistic religious / political philosophy, and the same could be said for other lesser known figures who were influenced by I mean, I think you have to. I almost think there's a difference between like people who are trained in these kind of like Saudi satellite facilities and are more radicalized in the traditional sense, as converts tend to be, in terms of espousing the more aggressively violent version of this. But yeah, for people who are technically in a cultural sense, Salafists, they're probably not in their daily lives looking to take over the world or anything. But that's kind of that's neither here nor there. I mean, that could be said for virtually any religious disposition.
Well, then I guess I'll ask you. Do you think that ISIS? What do you think ISIS's primary motivation is for, say, like occupying parts of Iraq and trying to establish a caliphate? Do you believe that that's primarily motivated by religion, or does it have a great deal to do with the invasion of Iraq?
I think it's both. But I mean, I think the invasion of Iraq created the conditions where that was even possible, right? So it created these radicalizing conditions. But in terms of, for example, committing genocide on Yazidis and minority Christians, I mean, I don't know that you could directly link that to a anti-imperialistic backlash or link it causally to the invasion of Iraq. I think again, the invasion of Iraq is what created the conditions whereby they could launch a genocidal campaign against Yazidis and minority Christians, and destroy their ancient homelands and that sort of thing. But I mean, if you look at and I know this is like almost a Sam Harris point, but it's not really, because like I don't think it should be dismissed as a Sam Harris point to simply look at what the specific justifications people give for their actions are. I mean, so if Baghdadi and his acolytes say that we're committing genocide upon Yazidis for these specific theological reasons, I think it's worth acknowledging that. And it doesn't mean that you'd also ignore the fact that these circumstances came about as a result of U.S. foreign policy. But it's possible to hold multiple ideas in your head at the same time.
Sure. I mean, do
you think so? How should we react when a guy like Baghdadi says, we're going to commit genocide on Yazidis for these theological reasons? So we just ignore that?
Oh, you mean like ignoring like not taking what he's saying at face value?
Right.
I mean, no, I mean, I understand where you're coming from on that, but at the same time, I feel like you're articulating a much more nuanced position on this than Tulsi Gabbard has. I mean, so that's the problem. I mean, once again, there is some oversimplification, to put it mildly, in the way she's discussing this, which leans uncomfortably for me, and not just me, but a lot of people who share my views, into things that kind of, and I'm not saying she's a neocon or influenced by neocons, but sound kind of neocon sometimes. And
I can understand that, and that's why one thing I've pointed out about her from the beginning is that in a rhetorical sense, she is informed by some conservative values, partly stemming from her upbringing in a socially conservative household, stemming from her military service, which obviously doesn't lend itself to like rhetorical radicalism. And I think you have manifestations of that, especially in the earlier part of her congressional career, where it does seem akin to some right-wing talking points. But again, if you kind of take everything in totality and you take, for example, how brutal she's been on neoconservatives. I mean, I don't know of a candidate in recent memory other than Paul Kucinich who has been more overtly critical of neoconservatism in particular. And she actually ties it into neoliberalism, which is also a new kind of rhetorical move that I think is unique to her. So again,
I don't agree with that either, but that's not a big deal.
You don't agree with what?
I just don't agree with the way she has equated neoconservatism with neoliberalism, because
I don't think she's equated them, but she's attacked both. I mean,
yes. But I think neoliberalism, as far as I've understood it, has been largely defined by like sort of an economic policy and not as much of a foreign policy. So
yeah, I mean, it has a foreign policy dimension, and yeah, sometimes she uses it sort of a shorthand, which she uses like to the extent that she equates the two. It's to say that there is a bipartisan foreign policy consensus that has influences on both the left and right, or Republican and Democrat, that has created the current untenable status quo. So I mean, I don't know that she's strictly equating the two, but she is implicating both in a failed policy.
Sure. So I guess I'll just put this to you.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure. Go ahead.
So how do you interpret the fact that she's the only Democrat of any notability who has challenged the Trump Russia narrative and actually put it into a geopolitical context, talking about the new Cold War and the fact that it will hasten the nuclear arms race, not just with Russia, but China? So she's challenging the great power struggle doctrine that has been promulgated by the Department of Defense under initially James Mattis, and basically every Democrat cheered that doctrine, and she's one of the only vociferous critics of that. I think at a lot of political risk, because there are plenty of Democrats who might, in a sense, be open to supporting her, who look at her saying this collusion nonsense has to stop. And that means she's 100% written off from any viability in their minds. And yeah, she's saying, we have to look at the consequences of the rhetoric that has been encouraged as a result of Russiagate. She's talked about how the Trump-Russian narrative has really given license to the intelligence services to intervene in domestic political affairs, which I've heard no other candidates talk about. So to what degree would you give her "quote unquote" credit for that posture?
That's a very good question, because that subject is kind of my wheelhouse in a way. I mean, I was actually, when I saw her starting to talk about that, I was kind of elated. I was like, oh, she's definitely saying things that I really want people to be saying in this forum. So the more optimistic part of me was like, this is good to have this just even being, put out there by someone who I guess could be argued now as sort of a mainstream politician. So I thought that was great. I guess the cynical part of me is wondering if she's politicking a little bit for votes from more the right side of the spectrum. And I only say that because, of course, just by default, most Trump supporters are going to completely reject the paradigm of Russiagate. So, but I don't know that. I think her rhetoric sounds very good in that area.
So you think that's a sound politicking strategy in a Democratic primary?
That's I don't know. I think that you hit on something earlier that I think is true, that there are some things about her that appear to be conservative. So I don't know.
Temperamentally, yeah.
So yeah, I don't know if it's a strategy. I mean,
she's dropped F-bombs recently, so maybe she's not as temperamentally conservative as I have been speculating.
But here's something I just want to quote back that you.
And she called Trump Saudi Arabia's bitch. Remember that?
She did. Yeah, she did.
So
she didn't call him Israel's bitch yet, though. Which
no,
she hasn't. Far for any politician, but you did say.
But just to complete the thought,
let me just read one quote from you, because you said this about 2 months ago, or a little.
Okay. you got the receipts. I like that
too. You said you've spoken with her extensively and have never heard her express anything remotely resembling a right-wing view. It's just nonsense. Some right-wingers like her because she rejects resistance-style rhetoric and isn't a screechy culture warrior, but her policy beliefs are left-wing.
Yes. I think that. And I feel like, I can almost relate to that, as you could probably imagine, because my having challenged the Russiagate narrative from the beginning, so starting in July of 2016, has led a lot of Trump supporters, to agree with my criticisms. And that always gets twisted as me personally being a stealth right winger. Always. To this day, every single day, I get that criticism. Okay. So when I see, when you kind of accuse her of politicking, I can almost see echoes of the ways in which I get denigrated for somehow having an ulterior motive where I'm courting Trump supporters or something, rather than just expressing an honest critique of what I think is an incredibly damaging, political dynamic that has overtaken the domestic political system and has really dangerous foreign policy consequences. And I think we've seen many of those. So I think to accuse her of politicking, I mean, if she really wanted to just quote politic, right? I don't know that she would have, if she would have resigned from the DNC in 2016 and endorsed Bernie Sanders at a time where everybody in the Democratic Party was saying, okay, we have to coalesce around Hillary, people. It's time. Get in line. Trump is such an existential danger that if you create any fissure within the Democratic coalition, you are evil because you're making it more likely that Trump's going to get elected. Okay, so that was not really politicking. I don't think going to Syria was politicking if she wanted to just have a nice, ordinary political career, which she probably would have had. She has a safe seat in Hawaii.
Oh yeah.
She could have risen through the ranks. She probably could have run for the Senate, at some point. Um, whereas going to Syria means that she's going to be called an apologist for a dictator for probably the rest of her life. Okay,
and that will happen. I mean, I
right?
completely agree.
And you have the collusion stuff, the ways that she, I think, has an honest and legitimate critique of the way of the superficial left liberal aggrandizing around identity issues. I think when she goes after that, yeah, some people on the right like it, but by the way, so do a lot of people on the left. There are a lot of robust left-wing critiques of superficial left liberal identity politics and the way that kind of is used to basically reinforce establishment orthodoxies ultimately. And you saying that the collusion thing was kind of a joke. I don't know that is really in her political interest in terms of her future in the Democratic Party. So I don't really have a good. I don't know that there's reasonable grounds to accuse her of acting with some kind of political motive in that sense. If anything, it's the complete opposite.
No, I hear you there. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I said that it's the cynical part of me, is because I have a lot of what I think you've agreed are some good faith criticisms of her. I am looking a little deeper into her rhetoric, and when I saw that, I definitely was excited. But at the same time, I'm not going to let my guard down completely because I don't know exactly what her sort of larger views are on this issue, but I think that it is extremely valuable, obviously, for a Democrat to be going against the Russiagate rhetoric. I mean, that is risky. So I agree with you on that it's not going to win her. I mean, if anything, it's going to damage her reputation in the Democratic Party. Right. But one thing that's bothered me about, I guess we haven't really gone over her voting record at all, but one thing that's sort of stuck in my craw about her votes in regards to this whole larger issue of Russia and Cold War 2.0 is I haven't seen her explain why she voted to send offensive weapons to Ukraine, which is something that Obama didn't even, put through. So I do feel like there needs to be even a little bit deeper of an explanation of that. Like, did she have a turnaround after after that vote where she realized that sending offensive weapons to Ukraine was something that could escalate things into a potentially really dangerous situation? Or does she still stand by that vote? Because to me, that vote runs in contradiction to some degree to what she's saying now, unless there's some kind of, turnaround moment. But that's the thing with some of the old votes she's made and old statements she's made is I haven't seen or heard her saying, yeah, I voted wrong on this, and here's why I feel differently now.
But you should blame journalists who, instead of asking her about that, which would be obviously a legitimate line of inquiry, and I'm actually be curious myself to hear her expound on that. Instead of asking her about that, every single interview she does, it's Assad, Assad, Assad. So I mean, to some extent, you have to lay blame on the media environment. I know I've been harping on that point, but I think it's actually crucial because it's not as though she is going to go and give a speech about that one vote that she made,
of course,
and explain her reasoning. I mean, you have to be prompted to discuss it. There's nobody who has the curiosity to prompt her on those kinds of issues. And I think she did undergo a real evolution in 2016, where the way that she viewed, I think, establishment orthodoxies changed. And do you take that at face value? No, you shouldn't take anything that a politician claims at face value. But I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest that evolution was genuine, at least in some respect. But no, I mean, you're right. Why don't we have somebody who's following her around in Iowa or something, asking her about that vote? I mean, I think that's almost a more fundamental question.
Yeah, well, I mean, you are right on the idea that the media. I mean, this was a vote that the media almost completely ignored. I would say one of the most important votes, maybe the last 4 years, and it was almost like it didn't happen. I mean, and the consensus for it was overwhelmingly bipartisan. There was only, I think, maybe
What was
11.
remind me what the year of that vote was?
I want to say 2015, but I'm not sure. I know there was actually, I believe there was more than one vote. There was more than one bill that had something attached to it with offensive weapons. And I know that
because there sometimes with these defense appropriations bills, there are amendments that get voted on for like strategic reasons, and then you don't vote for the overall bill. There can be legislative chicanery. I don't recall off the top of my head that specific vote. I'm aware of the vote kind of in the abstract. But either way, pressure on it just as you would any politician. It's just that there's nobody doing it. They want to relitigate the same old cliched and very tired and tedious talking points. And especially when she's getting attacked on such tendentious grounds. I almost feel it's worthwhile to point out how the media is obviously working in a maybe not a conscious, but in a seemingly concerted way to stigmatize and delegitimize her, where you had just the other day this raft of stories that Kamala Harris's people helped promote about how they took at face value the claims of the Daily Stormer that they single-handedly got her into the debates, and that claim, by a maniac who is an avowed troll and tries to insinuate himself into political stories to kind of trick the global media into giving him oxygen. You had that claim, which is mind-bogglingly absurd, propagated by all these establishment media organs without anybody questioning them. So when I see a concerted campaign like that to delegitimize somebody who has, however imperfectly, putting forth, I think you would acknowledge at least some kind of anti-war message, even if it's strictly legitimate, restricted to regime change. We just had a whole discussion about that where I don't think it's necessarily the case, but let's just say it is the case. Let's say she only cares about regime change, right? At least that's something. And then, but you have every day almost the most wacky criticisms, not just criticisms, like outright smears, I would say, being heaped on her. And nobody pushes back, really, who has any footing in traditional media. I mean, to the extent that I do, it's sort of in a tangential way. So that's sort of why my posture has been to call out or to highlight the absurdity of the media campaign to tarnish her on spurious grounds, which actually almost makes it more difficult to challenge her on legitimate grounds. Because when it's utterly dominated by attack after increasingly ridiculous attack from CBS or Politico or all these people, then that kind of, it sucks out, it reduces the opportunity to, I think, scrutinize her in a more fair-minded and justified fashion.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the desire to, I don't know if I would call it shielding her from these smear. I mean, I definitely fully agree with you that there is, it seems like there's a smear campaign against her every week, happening, especially since she ran. I mean, so, and I have sort of
and let me ask you, what is the fact that there is such a concerted smear campaign against her in establishment media organs tell you about her message? Because that tends to happen to people who challenge, especially foreign policy establishment orthodoxies, right? So, like, what do you infer from the fact that like every week there's a new and increasingly ridiculous smear campaign?
I guess I would, without using a phrase like the deep state, I would say that there is a faction of the ruling class who feels threatened by her, very threatened by some of her rhetoric. And I guess that's as far as I'll go with it, because I do believe that there's a lot of money on the line, especially in terms of the military industrial complex, with just if we're specifically isolated to the war on terror, I feel like they still make a killing, no pun intended, in that area. So I don't know if, weapon sales, I it's hard to say exactly where that's coming from, but I would like to think it's because she's threatening the military industrial complex as a whole. I don't, that's not a belief that I hold, but I would like to believe it.
And by the way, she attacks the military industrial complex by name. I mean,
she has, that's true. Yeah.
Which is also anomalous.
Yes. And just, you explained a little bit about where you were coming from. And I guess I should just say, since people who don't know me or don't really know, follow my work or anything, I mean, I've been sort of accused of, putting a purity test on her. And I think that I'm coming more from the perspective of almost like idealism. I would say I'm more of an idealist. And for me, it's really, really important for people, especially who remember what this country was like before 9/11, to try to reclaim that pre 9/11 mindset, because regardless of a few things here and there, if you want to argue about the motivations of ISIS or things like that, but I think for the most part, and I think you and I probably agree on this, almost everything that came out of 9/11 in terms of US policy is horrific, if not based on a fundamental, distortion of the truth or a lie. So
yeah, and let me just interject really quickly, because there are a lot of people I've seen just glancing at the comments here and there, and I've seen it on Twitter occasionally too. They're saying, "Oh, you apply these really strict, idealistic standards to Tulsi, but you not Bernie. Like, you're giving Bernie a pass." I don't think that you're doing that, right? So you don't. It's not as if that you're saying that Bernie is the paragon of virtue on this subject either, correct?
No. I mean, in fact, in 2016, we had Cindy Sheehan on our podcast to kind of, it was kind of a Bernie hate session in a way. I mean, we really dug into him. If I'm being honest, I think that I've already feel like I've done my due diligence in exposing Bernie as a naked imperialist. I think his domestic policies are, I think, are pretty good. For the most part. His foreign policy, I've always had a pretty fundamental problem with. I mean, if you search my Twitter feed, you could find plenty of negative things I said about Bernie. But in this particular election, I mean, if I'm going to vote in the Democratic Party, I would vote Bernie over Tulsi, just for the overall picture. And I think one point Bernie has over Tulsi is that he has a tried and true, let's say, trustworthy record, in the sense that he has a lot of history behind him, and sort of,
since that he's 40 years older than her.
Exactly, so yeah, Tulsi Gabbard's my age. I mean, that's a very short career in politics.
Are you 38?
Yeah, I am. She's actually only born about a month before me or after me. It's pretty weird, actually, when I saw that.
Yeah,
but
I think her birthday is April 81. So
yeah, so no, I mean, I think, recently I have been saying that I would, I would openly vote for Bernie over Tulsi, and maybe that's why people are believing that I'm a bit soft on him. But no, I mean, I think it's pretty clear.
Wait, so you would vote for somebody who you said was like a brutal imperialist?
I didn't say brutal,
or whatever.
I said he's fundamentally an imperialist.
Okay, yeah.
But
I mean, it's just like, people can go read about this, and I've known this forever, which is that, Bernie, for example, voted for the Iraq Liberation Act in the 90s, which set the groundwork for the invasion a couple of years later. Yeah, there are many examples that, don't get as much airtime now, but I think
his promotion of Russiagate was really disgusting.
Yeah,
He promote his when he talks about Putin, even when he went on Joe Rogan, it's like he has this knee-jerk need to what's the right word, to sort of say, oh, I'm not a, people say I'm like Maduro. He has a need to like go after Maduro and Assad to like make sure people know that he's not, like a tanky or whatever the hell, the word right? Like that. So I don't like it. I cringe a lot of the time when I'm watching him. But I think when domestic policy is very strong. But yeah, I mean, so I don't know. I mean, I don't think that people are ever going to be happy about that, because I have really focused on Tulsi. Like, I will admit that I have been I've been focusing pretty specifically on her.
Yeah, I mean that's fine with me. I mean, she's an interesting candidate, and as I mentioned before, generates a lot of attention and discussion online, which I think the reasons for that online interest are sort of interesting to examine in their own right. It's sort of similar to how Ron Paul gained traction initially. Although, obviously it's sort of a different environment now with social media and YouTube and on a much grander scale, in 2019 as opposed to 2007. But there's something there that's sort of like a trend line you can kind of discern.
For sure. I mean, I think she's definitely taken some cues from the Ron Paul strategy in many, many different ways. Unlucky for Ron Paul, he had a basically a bullseye painted on his back, with those Lou Rockwell newsletters.
Right.
And while
Jamie Kirchick, I remember when
Dave Weigel, people don't realize it, but Jamie Kirchick and Dave Weigel did kind of a double team effort on it. And
Jamie Kirchick went. There was a moment in December of 2011. I don't know if you remember this, when Ron Paul was actually leading polls for the Iowa caucus.
Yes.
And that's when Jamie Kirchick came out and dropped the newsletters as a bombshell, as though they hadn't been thoroughly discussed 4 years prior. But it was presented as sort of like new and shocking information. And the New York Times ran a column from him with all the worst excerpts and that kind of thing. And it was like timed specifically to undercut Ron Paul at a moment where it seemed, shockingly, he actually had a decent possibility of winning the Iowa caucus, which would have caused people to have a total meltdown.
The timing you're talking about is really interesting, because when that story came out, Ron Paul was polling just on the cusp of being able to be in the next debate. And right when Jamie Kirchick dropped that story, he went down one place, which was below the threshold required to be in the next debate.
In 2011 or 2007?
I think it was. I don't remember.
2011. In 2011, in the 2012 cycle, Ron Paul was in all the debates, I think.
Yeah, then I think this was earlier.
Yeah, that would have been 2008.
Yeah,
I'm saying they resurrected it in 2012. And then presented it as new information when with 2 weeks or something before the caucus, Ron Paul, inexplicably was leading the polls in Iowa.
Yeah, I mean, and I actually think Tulsi did the right thing in terms of trying to explain some of her past, like, homophobic views and some of those of her family. I mean, she did the right thing, where I believe Ron Paul did the wrong thing by saying, I didn't write it, I didn't even read them. I mean, that's a total cop-out. But
it's probably true, though.
If it was, it doesn't look good for him.
It doesn't look good, but it's probably true. I mean,
but I think that's the one area where Tulsi has actually done about face, or she has attempted to. I don't know if a lot of people bought it. I've actually kind of like, that's fine with me. But I think that she needs to do that on some of these other things that she's changed on over time. But I mean, that one I can understand, because that's such a sensitive issue now. But I could see why she felt the need to do that. But yeah, I mean, I need to get out of here in a little bit, but I don't know if you want to continue talking about Tulsi or
whatever you want. We could move on to Russia stuff or whatever you're interested in. Well, you had a suggestion that now escapes me.
I have another receipt of yours.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to know if you.
Oh my God, I feel like I'm on the hot seat in like a BBC Hard Talk interview. Even though we can't see you, you're just a black square on the screen.
You can't see them sweating bullets. So this is what you said in your interview with Cenk Uygur, or wasn't an interview, it was a debate about Russiagate with Cenk Uygur. I think it was probably the last time you appeared there. For 50 minutes, 55 seconds into the debate.
Wait, was this the debate that I did this year?
I believe
was it on the okay, so that actually wasn't on the Young Turks. That was done on Zed Jelani and Leighton Woodhouse's podcast, and then I posted it as my own podcast. So that was actually not on the Young Turks itself, but it doesn't really matter. Go ahead.
Okay, then I'm not sure. Then it might be either one. I'm not sure which one it is, but I think it was a videotaped debate. It was on YouTube.
Okay, I'll let you know which one it was based on the quote.
So, and there is some other context here, so you'll have to fill me in. But at the time, you said to Kachank, I'll even concede that there's a preponderance of evidence at this point that there was some Russian state actor in the hack of the DNC and Podesta. What do I mean? I guess break that down for me. Like, what do you think that do you still agree with that? Am I taking that out of context?
I mean, I think I was conceding that point as an argumentative tactic to make a broader point, which I obviously don't have it in front of me right now, but it was just to not get hung up on the kind of epistemological question of like, what was the source of Russian hacking, right? So there was like a broader point to be made that could be made irrespective of whether Russia did or did not carry out the hack. So, if you notice the words, if you notice the precise wording, it was almost I'm conceding that point for a specific argumentative purpose, not conceding it like on its own terms, if that makes sense. It's sort of like a subtle debate strategy that I think would be clear if you kind of listen to the before and after of that one little snippet.
Okay. So you don't agree that there's like, I mean, do you think there's provable evidence right now that Russian state actors are behind the hacking and the subsequent release of those emails?
Well, I mean, I think there is a large amount of public evidence to bolster that point. Even if you just look at the Mueller report, there's evidence that is laid out to justify the notion that Russian hackers committed the DNC hack, right? But so in saying that there was a preponderance of evidence on that doesn't mean that you're saying that it happened. It's just saying you're acknowledging the existence of the evidence, which for the longest time didn't exist at all. I mean, so there was like for the first 2 years of this whole saga, there was no evidence whatsoever linking Russian state actors to the DNC or Podesta hack. But
we don't believe CrowdStrike.
Well, I mean, I guess CrowdStrike. Yeah, there was CrowdStrike, but then Mueller issued an indictment in July of 2018, which named specific Russians in the GRU, et cetera, as alleged that they committed the hack, et cetera. So you have to at least accept that as evidence that's now in the public domain. Doesn't mean it's dispositive evidence. Doesn't mean it can't be challenged, which it ought to be, but because of the realities of the U.S. Judicial system, that evidence is probably never going to be challenged in an adversarial manner in a court of law, which actually should lead you to be more skeptical of the validity of that evidence. But no, I mean that little snippet that you read there, I don't think was an affirmation from me that Russia did the hack. It was just an affirmation of an acknowledgement of the existing evidence that leads a lot of people to believe that Russia did in fact do the hack, which you kind of need to do in service of making a broader point argumentatively. At least that's my recollection of why I said that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, because I would even concede that it's possible, Russia did hack the DNC, possibly even multiple times, or hack the State Department. I mean, it seems like cyber warfare in terms of just hacking into systems is fairly common. It's what's interesting to me about that is it's possible that that they found a legit Russian hack, but then transposed it to, oh, this is how they got the emails of some kind. I mean, that's just a theory that I've had.
Yeah, and there's, in terms of Russia, what's considered hacking now. I mean, the word has lost all meaning. I mean, you look at the Senate Intelligence Committee report that came out a couple weeks ago, where they examined all Russian internet election interference in 2016 in terms of like the election system, and they kind of cast pinging public-facing websites as this shocking and dangerous attack on American democracy, as though public-facing websites don't get pinged all day, every day, and whether it comes from a state actor or somebody else doesn't make a whole lot of difference, frankly. So it kind of matters. It's how you frame it, right? So, but because of people are generally not that knowledgeable about the intricacies of, what constitutes hacking or pinging or any of this online, information, quote unquote warfare, it's very easy to manipulate public opinion by just throwing out some scary sounding words and blaming it all on Russia. But even in the Mueller report, on the DNC hack in particular, Mueller concedes that it's possible that WikiLeaks received the DNC emails through an intermediary who he doesn't name. So, like, Mueller almost undercuts the notion that it's been conclusively confirmed that Russia specifically transferred the DNC emails to WikiLeaks. But of course, that got almost zero attention in the aftermath of the Mueller report, except for like me and a few other people pointing it out.
Yeah, I even noticed. I think it was Aaron Monte who pointed out that the Dutch intelligence claim of when they surveilled the GRU hacking into the DNC didn't actually line up with what was in the timing of when the Mueller report says that it happened. So that's also noteworthy. But do you have any? Have you leaned in any direction towards the idea that it was leaked by an insider? I mean, I know you don't dabble with the Seth Rich stuff, but just the general concept of it being a local smuggling out of the emails, like an internal hack, if you want to call it.
I mean, I'm open to the possibility, of course. I just think that when discussing Russiagate amongst people who are not like ingrained skeptics, it's useful to make certain rhetorical concessions where you're not conceding any affirmative belief in the predominant Russian hacking narrative, but you're kind of setting that aside in order to make broader points about the inanity and the harm of other aspects of how the narrative is sort of manifested. So yeah, I mean, I think especially with Mueller himself adding this kind of pretty explosive qualifier in terms of the sequence of events which led to WikiLeaks publishing the DNC emails. Mueller gave every reason for skepticism on that front with his own words. So no, I'm not. I'm not gonna. I don't like when people get ahead of themselves and use. Yeah. So I mean, I'm open to the possibility of alternate explanations because no official explanation, I think, even now has been conclusively established.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested. I mean, for a while, I was really on board with people like Craig Murray, and so I think it was like that VIP's intelligence group that was.
Yeah.
They had proof that it was an insider leak. I mean, I just simply don't know at this point. It's pretty murky.
Yeah, it's still murky, and it's almost a side issue. I mean, so let's stipulate that Russian state actors did hack the DNC. Okay, I mean, would that have justified the entire U.S. political system being mired in this insanity for 3 years? No. I mean, so that's why I think it's almost worth even like conceding that point in a way, because it almost doesn't matter, if that's the extent to which Russian state actors are interfering in our democracy, meaning they're giving the public information about how its most powerful political officials act in private, that's probably the most benevolent foreign intervention of all time. I mean, it's not as though they're toppling the government or, manipulating votes, which actually would have been a serious issue, but that didn't happen. So
Rachel Maddow probably thinks that happened. But
well, I mean, I think there were polls. I don't know what the latest figures are, but there were polls throughout 2017 which said showed a majority of Democrats believe that Russia not only didn't just quote unquote hack the election, they believe that they actually changed vote totals. And that therefore Trump was like literally illegitimate in the sense that the votes that he supposedly garnered were fake.
Weird. I must have missed that one.
Yeah. You can go look it up. That I could pull it up, but
I should probably run now, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But thank you for having me on. It's a lively discussion.
Yeah. I feel like you almost had me on, but it just ended up that it was done through my channel. So it was kind of like a mutual, a mutual hosting experience.
Sure.
All right.
Well, thank you. And hopefully your audience enjoyed it. And yeah, take care.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.